I guess probably the one thing I was just thinking that I can guarantee is that nobody will have heard anything about Jean Welz. He's one of those rare characters, rare interesting characters who is genuinely unknown. And so the challenge is I'm talking to you about somebody you'll have never heard of and know nothing about, a book you won't have read. So forgive me if I begin with a small aside. I enjoy indulging in a little idle speculation about a secret topic that perhaps some of you have dwelled upon, any researchers anyway, just a little more than they would like to freely admit in public, which is the researcher's dream. Now, this particular fantasy has a number of components. First, no one else has discovered the subject, or at least seen its potential. You can tell why it's a dream, can't you? The surface may have been scratched, but no more than that. And this could be just the topic that you have been waiting for, dreaming of, the one that you will fall completely in love with. Now, let's face it, today, how likely is that? With hundreds of thousands of toilers in the libraries of the world scratching around for any hint of a subject with potential, some potential, any potential. The fact is, it's not too likely, but it is still possible. It does happen. It might be you that discovers it. Secondly, when you discover this subject, it becomes not a moment's interest, a flirtation that runs out of steam in an hour or two, a day or two, a week or two, even a year or two, but the fantasy that keeps on going, keeps on giving. This particular fantasy defies gravity. It never runs into the sand. Each discovery makes the picture more and more fascinating, and somehow adds a little to the story every time, instead of the normal process where new things don't quite make sense or join up with what you've already found. In this case, however obscure the new thing is, it somehow sets off more and more connections, joins not just one, but several stray ideas together, and instead of dying the death after a decent interval, it refuses to stop, spreading its tentacles further and further until the excitement reaches a climax. You have reached the third component. The messy business of research has finally yielded something approaching a recognizable shape, and that shape eventually forms into the researcher's dream, a gripping yarn. An unknown subject, fascinating discovery after fascinating discovery, and finally a gripping yarn that adds up to become the final component, a genuinely unique story. Of course, you won't have guessed by now, the story of Jean Welz's architecture was that once in a lifetime, if you are lucky, piece of good fortune, the researcher's dream. The downside was that it took 10 years to get to this point, the book that was finally published last June. Now, while a fantasy that lasts a decade is in some respects rather wonderful, it's also a hell of a long time on the same topic. I should now warn you of a spoiler alert. The one revelation I will make before we start in on the detail is an idea I would like you to bear in mind. The unknown architect developed a unique critique of Le Corbusier's 5 points of modern architecture. Not only unique, but highly sophisticated. An opposition steeped in the ideas of the modern architect who was arguably Le Corbusier's opposite number in Vienna, that is, Adolf Loos. I know of no other architect who developed such a critique, but even were one to exist as yet undiscovered or underexploited, I doubt that it would be as complete an alternative as I feel Jean Welz developed in Paris, and essentially between 1928 and 1933, a remarkably short period. Although this project threw up many pleasures, the other side of this particular coin is that Jean Welz's architecture was virtually absent from the historical record in the two main cities of this story, Vienna and Paris. To complete the set, it was also missing in a third city, Johannesburg in South Africa, where Welz arrived in early February 1937 to the country where nearly 40 years later he would die a famous painter but still unknown as an architect. Let me move on to that tricky situation that, as I entitled the first chapter of the book, Jean Welz does not exist. This will be comforting for you. The one thing that bedevils progress in any research is an absence of material. A later chapter, for example, the Gavrekian letter, epitomizes the situation which I found myself. A generous academic had sent me a note that she had discovered a handwritten letter in a fairly obscure Paris archive that had a scrawled version of the word Welz in it. That was it. One word. In the context of Jean Welz in Paris, that was a breakthrough. The letter was from Gabriel Gavrekian, who had worked with Mallet Stevens, and he had designed the famous Cubist garden at the Villa Noailles, that is, Gavrekian had. And the letter was dated April 1926. It was addressed to Tristan Tzara, co-founder of Dada and the client for the only house that Adolf Loos built in Paris. Now, despite that impressive heritage, it was a rather banal note apologising for a problem in finding building labour, just notified to Gavrekian by this chap Welz. However, it is not otherwise recorded that Gavrekian was responsible for finding labourers for the Tzara House, or indeed was involved in the building at all. And interesting that it was not addressed to the architect Adolf Loos, at that time resident in Paris, but that such tasks were, as it were, outsourced to Gavrekian. Now, Loos was itinerant in never having a practice, and in Paris he lodged in various other architects' offices, Mallet Stevens and Raymond Fischer, who would become Jean Welz's later employer. I discovered that Gavrekian had actually known Loos in Vienna since 1921. Unlike Welz, and on a visit of my own to Vienna, I found in the university class records that Welz and Gavrekian had been classmates in 1920. A further connection was that photos of the Tzara House had been taken by André Kertész, who Welz had known almost since his arrival in Paris the previous year for the Art Deco exhibition, that's 1925, and whom he described as his best friend in Paris. The two of them hung out at the Café Dôme in Montparnasse, and one day two attractive blondes came in, and the canny Welz persuaded Kertész to invite them to their table, as he had instantly picked one of them out to marry. And, dear reader, he did so. Inga, a redoubtable Danish woman who became the partner of the rest of his life. It was in this fragmentary way that a jigsaw began to take shape, whose pieces uncannily fitted together, and gradually, very gradually, built up a fascinating picture of the relatively small world of the Paris avant-garde of the 1920s. An example not in the book is a letter to Inga Welz from the wife of Le Corbusier's musician brother, which in turn led me to finding out that Jean and Inga almost weekly attended musical soirees in the brother's house, the one built for him by Le Corbusier and now part of the Fondation Corbusier in Paris. Although Welz was virtually invisible in the historical record, he seemed to have lived in the heart of the Paris avant-garde, suggesting that the more formal conventional sources of corroboration of the historical record can sometimes be less illuminating than the informal patchwork of traces that are more like real life, a theme to which I will return at the end of the talk. It's rare to come across an artist in any medium who is genuinely unknown, but to eventually come to the conclusion that this unknown fellow produced work of the highest quality is to hope for far too much, but is the real heart of this saga. In architecture, where the artifacts are so large, it would seem to be even more unlikely that something as big as a building can lack the most basic information, such as who designed it, especially where that design has enough merit to mark it out to anyone with an eye for design. However, the house that set me off on this trail was credited in the local town hall to the wrong architect. My discovery of Jean Welz began on the afternoon after Christmas lunch, 2012, during a post-prandial stroll in the 19th arrondissement in the northeast of Paris. I had in fact seen the house before, the Maison Zilvelli, and it was quite a sight for sore eyes. But something about it on that festive afternoon determined me to find out who was behind it. It was modern, indeed modernist, but in such a state of disrepair and decay that it seemed even then on the edge of collapse, with the long side facade propped up by an incongruous forest of wooden beams that I later found out was erected by the medieval compagnon of carpenters who had played such a big part in the construction of cathedrals around France, including, of course, Notre Dame. The Maison Zilvelli was oriented, as indicated on the simple hand-drawn plan, to two other major Parisian tourist attractions, the Eiffel Tower and Sacré-Cœur, the latter to the left and the former lower right. Both are miles distant from the house and suggest how Jean Welz imaginatively made the most of the long, thin site, perched on the edge of an unstable hill, which was opened for housing in 1927, having the tape cut by Josephine Baker, and where Zilvelli would be built 6 years later in 1933. The mad hair person at the back is Jean Welz. That short period from 1927 to 33 was effectively the length of Jean Welz's career in Paris. Zilvelli was to be his last major design to be built, the climax, as it were, of a highly intensive period that only began right at the end of 1927, in the December of that year, when he was appointed chef de cabinet, or chief architect, to Raymond Fischer, the architect whose name appears in the local town hall as the architect of the Maison Zilvelli, for the important and generous reason that Welz was not registered as an architect in France and worked on the black, as what Fischer called a nerf viennois, a ghostwriter. That fact accounts in part for Welz's anonymity, which only really came home to me when I met up in Paris with the expert in interwar Austrian and German modernism, the late Iris Meder, who had written on every nook and cranny of the architects of the interwar period, but knew nothing of Jean Welz and was simply, quote, amazed, unquote, by Zilvelli and his other key houses, and simply couldn't understand how she had not really come across him before. I'm afraid I'd stolen her researcher's dream. Zilvelli, as I saw that Christmas afternoon, looked to my eyes, I have to admit, like an amateur fan of Le Corbusier's Heidegger modernism, but had not quite got the idea. It also looked in perilous condition. But today I know that I was utterly wrong about the Le Corbusier idea, and a recent discovery that Welz knew Eugène Freycinet, the great French engineer and inventor of pre-stressed concrete, personally, suggests the peril may have been more superficial than it appears, and the fact that Zilvelli was demolished last summer, an even greater scandal. The last Welz chef d'oeuvre masterwork, becoming the first of his designs to be destroyed, is an irony the world could perhaps do without. The big lesson I learned about Zilvelli was that the extreme of plainness I took for amateurism was, if anything, the opposite, the total opposite, and that here in the middle of Paris was an intruder from Vienna. The plainness of the windows in the front facade was the opposite of the carelessness that it might first appear to be, but Welz's version of the famous attack on ornament by Le Corbusier's opposite number in Vienna, Adolf Loos. In fact, I guess that Zilvelli was in certain ways Jean Welz's tribute to Loos, who died in the very same year Zilvelli was built. But Welz arguably succeeded in taking these principles further than the master, in the banishing of ornament and the creation of a highly varied promenade architecturale, as Le Corbusier called the path from the street to the roof of a house, and which Raymond Fischer called Le Chemin Aérien, or the aerial way, his translation from visiting Loos's architectural school in the early 1920s in Vienna, his translation of what would be later christened the Raumplan. Now, Fischer's version, his translation, seems to be a more appropriately visual term for the winding path Welz created in Zilvelli, a theme he had taken up with a vengeance in his first house for Fischer, the Maison Dubin of 1927-8, a house literally joined on to one of the classics of modernism, the Maison Cook, in which Le Corbusier announced the 5 points of modern architecture that would become the commandments of young architects for generations to come. Imagine Jean Welz, aged 27, being given his first opportunity to design a modern house. He had designed a traditional house for Joseph Hoffman, who was his professor and then his employer from October 1918 to September 1925. But this design was to be alongside Le Corbusier's house, itself flanked by a Mallet Stevens house. Welz had worked for Mallet Stevens briefly in 1925. And this was indeed a remarkable terrace of just 3 houses just beyond the walls of Paris. So Welz visited Corbusier to ask if he wished him to carry on the roofline established by the Maison Cook. Corbu told the young Welz it was his design and he should do as he liked. Welz rather took that advice to heart. In the Maison Dubin, I believe that Jean Welz began a quite remarkable journey in which he brought the full force of Vienna to bear upon modernist Paris, in what I see as a rigorous campaign opposing the 5 points, with an exploration and development of the contrasting and opposing ideas of Adolf Loos. Where the contemporaneous Villa Molaire by Loos had 6 levels, a late version of Loos's cubism in moving rooms up and down within the outer 4 walls, depending on their significance, and linked by short flights of steps, the 3 steps up, 3 steps down of Loos, the Maison Dubin had 9 levels and 15 rooms, compared to the 3 levels and 6 rooms of the Maison Cook next door. In Welz's first modern design, he went Loos with a vengeance. Raymond Fischer was so impressed by Jean Welz, to whom he was probably introduced by Adolf Loos himself, that he gave Welz a signed photo, thanking him for his collaboration on the design. The Maison Dubin has none of the 5 points, barring a roof terrace, in fact 3 roof terraces, outdoing Corbusier even on the roof. The small cubic balcony on the front facade, Welz told his son, was a theme as in music, which he repeated and varied throughout the house. Now, little or nothing has been written about the Maison Dubin, perhaps because the small Paris avant-garde knew or suspected that Raymond Fischer was not the real designer, despite the plaque still in the street outside that credits him. And Fischer knew everyone and was a founding patron of L'Architecture d'Aujourd'hui, the house magazine of the Paris modernists. His reputation as an architect was not too high among the cognoscenti, but it would not have been quite on to discuss Welz, the backroom boy, embarrassing for Fischer, and Welz was on the black and illegal, as it were. Between the Maison Dubin, completed in 1928, and Welz's 2 major houses of 1932, this is the Villa Darmstädter, and 1933, Maison Zilvelli, there were over 20 projects Welz completed. But first, I will draw your attention to 2 more houses, 1 block of flats and 2 big unbuilt projects that post-date 1933. The 2 houses are both dated 1929. First, the Villa Kolper was described as a medium-price house on a more modest budget than the Maison Dubin discussed just now, but showing a continuity with Dubin, although it's an insert between brick or stone houses. The first floor long window combines that Corbusian feature with an interior on 2 levels, à la Loos, an ingenious combination behind 1 window and combined internally with steel pillars to devise an open plan floor. The second, the Atelier Kielberg, has one of the most striking exteriors on a modernist house in Paris that I know. Built on what was formerly 2 plots and with a relatively shallow depth, the house commands the short narrow street like no other building in Paris of the period. The rear elevation is equally dramatic, but on a shallow plot makes the most of its windows to bring light into the interior and full height opening doors on the ground floor to bring in what outside garden was available. It compares rather favourably to my mind with the Villa Stein de Monzy, first the rear view, then the front elevation. Welz's front is a tight composition with a cubist exterior unlike any other building of the time, and using the horizontal full-length balcony to emphasize that horizontal and reduce the vertical visually, in both ways dramatizing its presence on the street. To me, it seems to be one of the most original modernist houses in Paris, and perhaps here, for the very first time, for a very wealthy foreign industrialist client, Sir Francis Cloyer-Kehlberg, Welz spread his wings. The largest project Welz designed was the block of flats on the Rue Charon in the 13th arrondissement of Paris. This was another project that Raymond Fischer, his boss, gave collaborator credit for to Welz. And the facades and the economy of the internal layouts of what were intended as low-cost workers' flats both show a Welzian flair. The two large unbuilt projects I have not been able to precisely date. The first, a sanatorium in southern France, was proposed for a former hotel site and is the best architectural drawing perhaps by Welz that we have. It may be compared to the famous Alto Sanatorium, although for a facility with 4 to a room rather than 1 to the room of the Alto. Welz must have worked quite some time on the project, as the floor plans are properly detailed for both a typical floor and the ground floor layout. The exterior, to my eyes, stands up rather well to any comparison with the Alto building and argues for Welz's ability with much larger projects than the single house. The second large unbuilt project was Welz's entry for the 1937 Paris exhibition, the Austrian Pavilion proposal. On a relatively tight site, Welz created a very varied path that rises and falls in levels and turns around 180 degrees to return to the street of entry. This may have in fact been Welz's final attempt to remain in Paris, but as an unknown quantity with zero political backing in Vienna, it wasn't even shortlisted. In a little over 5 years, Welz had designed 27 buildings, mainly for Raymond Fischer, culminating in only his second independent project, the Maison Zilvelli, in 1933. This is Zilvelli New. Welz flies into the air to provide direct views of the Eiffel Tower from that long window, twinned with the same view from the solarium above, and to Sacre-Cœur from the back picture window, twinned even more remarkably with the same view from the extraordinary balcony, supported by a 6 centimetre reinforced concrete blade with the wood shuttering marks exposed as one of the first béton bleu planes, perhaps, in the history of architecture. None of that was Loos. It was all Jean Welz. And here his campaign against the 5 points reached a climax. Close inspection reveals that none of the 5 go without contradiction at Zilvelli. The Villa Darmstadt of the previous year was, for Fischer, but all Welz. To my eyes, this is simply the best modernist house there is. Quite a claim. But for me, its combination of purity and sophistication is both highly original and beautiful. If great art strips away, here I feel that Welz harnessed perhaps the greatest name in the history of architecture, Andrea Palladio, to create a new set of conditions upon which a modern architecture could evolve, and in contrast with Corbusier's 5 points. It outdoes Palladio in the purity of the 2 flanking brick planes and in the picture frame stroke portico of the central area, with the loggia overlooking the garden and the full height glazing of the ground floor doors onto the terrace and garden behind. Palladio's pillars are there, but set back, the verticals of the picture frame either side, the thin metal pillars behind the glass on both levels, here functional over grandiose. In the book I go into quite some detail about what I see as Welz's appropriation of Palladio and what could possibly have been his dialogue, quote unquote, with Le Corbusier, who declared his 1920s villas had been his attempt to recreate the spirit of Palladio. This quote unquote dialogue, like the rest of Welz's key works, I see him as laying out his stall in opposition to the 5 points, silently on his drawing board, in Raymond Fischer's back room. A monologue, in fact. But it's also just possible that as Welz knew Corb, who seems to have thought well of him, calling him a wit, and writing a note of recommendation when Welz was forced to abandon his beloved Paris as the work ran out in the long wake of the 1929 crash. Perhaps there was an actual dialogue of some sort. On the other hand, it may be more likely that Welz talked with Loos about the 5 points, and Loos's rejection of fashionable materials and techniques in favour of what he called building like the Romans. Palladio pillaged ancient Rome for inspiration, visiting 4 times in the 1540s, sketching ruins and annotating his copy of Vitruvius extensively, and contributing importantly to the re-edition of Vitruvius by Palladio's client and mentor, Cornaro. This is the Villa Cornaro. And of course, ancient Roman architecture itself pillaged ancient Greece for many of its forms. Pierre Charot of the Maison de Verre fame, in a 1935 article in L'Architecture d'Aujourd'hui, picked his 3 best modernist houses. On the left, the Villa Stein de Monzy, bottom right, another white villa by Loos, and top right, the Villa Darmstädter. The last is so different from the first 2, and to my eyes at least, aesthetically purer. It was credited to Raymond Fisher in the article, which brings us to the 2 big questions about Welz. The first is, to what extent can one fairly claim Darmstädter and other credits as Welz's designs? Fisher called Welz his collaborator on only 3 projects. Maison Douban, the first house he worked on together, the Rue de Charonne block of flats, and 7 very modest houses and flats in Montauban near Toulouse in southwest France, replacing houses destroyed in a flood in 1930 by the River Tarn that flows through the town. The key case again is the Villa Darmstädter. Let us look at a 1938 house by Fisher after Jean Welz had gone to South Africa. The photo is very poor quality, I'm afraid, but the bones of the design can just about be made out. It has some elements we find in Darmstädter, but look again at the original. I say a few words in the book about the comparison, but perhaps here that is unnecessary. But I'll say it anyway. The Fisher version, to my eye, is ham-fisted compared to the original. Why would Fisher give credit for one house and not another? Now, we know the name over the door takes the risks, has to find the clients, run the office and pay the staff. So the tradition where that is also the name that gets the credit is not without reason. Credit can also bring prestige, which brings more work. And there are many recent examples where architects have walked out when uncredited for their designs. With Darmstädter, there was also a tiny clue that Fisher had been slightly annoyed with Welz, the only time he made a pointed criticism, that if Welz had had his way, rooms would be too open where he preferred to be able to close them. Now look at the upper glazing. It has fixed windows rather than the opening doors of the lower floor. This small clue joined 1 or 2 more, if anything even more obscure, to build a rather radical conception in my mind of what Welz might have been up to at the Villa Darmstädter. I came across what is possibly the original Welz plan, and it had rather striking implications in the picture I was assembling for this design. It was found by a Greek architectural historian in a book in his library he had almost forgotten about, a 1934 Italian collection of modernist houses he had bought in a second-hand bookshop in Athens, who had bought it from a German officer during the war. Its significance for me lay in the half circles visible at the front of the plan of the upper floor, the lower one here. They signified opening doors, 5 of them, plus 1 fixed window in front of the pillar, a similar pattern to the lower floor facade, which had 6 opening doors and 2 fixed matching full-length glazed windows. It seemed the upper floor had originally been intended to have opening doors. But if there were to have been opening doors, the room may not have been intended to be a bedroom as it became, but possibly an open loggia overlooking the garden below. That rang bells in relation to Palladio, and a couple of his houses of the second decade with a similar feature. Here, the Villa Pisani, a portico 2 floors high, with an open loggia on the upper floor, in both cases rear elevations looking onto the garden. I also rather later visited the Queen's House at Greenwich on the River Thames. The very morning it reopened for visitors in 2020. Designed by Inigo Jones and begun in 1619, Jones was a huge fan of Palladio. His copy of the 4 books of architecture was heavily annotated, and he had gone to the extent of searching out Palladio's assistant some years after the great man's death. It too had a rear elevation with a similar feature, the upper floor loggia overlooking a garden, in this case extending up the hill towards the Greenwich Observatory, thus providing a splendid view of the rising landscape. Inigo Jones's house was not completed until 1636, but he was credited with bringing in the Enlightenment to England as a pioneer almost 400 years before the Villa Darmstädter. This vertiginous sense of the history of architecture, extending from ancient Rome, whose architects had plundered ancient Greek architecture, to Palladio's plundering of Roman ruins in the mid-16th century, to Inigo Jones almost a century later, shooting forward to the modest but sublime Villa Darmstädter a further 400 years later, was a quite marvellous panorama to contemplate. However, I cannot claim to have anything approaching conclusive scholarship to seal such a panorama, as it were, in stone. That brings me to the second point, the wider question of the paucitative evidence that Jean Welz even existed in Vienna and Paris, and the way that fact found itself into how I eventually came to write the book, that is, the mode of its writing, that I was forced to develop in order to deal with the absence of conventional scholarly corroboration, a question that may interest some of you, if there are any historians among you today. I'm rather hoping this, as it were, backstage issue may be of interest to more of you, because otherwise I'm in trouble. It's over 10 years now that I began the research into what was published last summer. Some projects taking even longer than that, but getting on for a decade is a long period to live off crumbs. The gods were very kind to me in that each piece of the jigsaw fitted in, added to the picture, gave it complexity and depth. As you will be all aware, that itself is rare luck indeed. Nevertheless, you may already perhaps have a sense of the relatively fragile nature of the rope I was weaving, and that did not make for the classic architectural monograph, able to consult many sources and to cross-reference both scholarly discussion and personal testimony, extending down the years of the architectural career of the subject and beyond. The very valuable advice I received, in particular from the great writer on Loos, Professor Christopher Long, was to put my personal view and experience of the quest at the centre of this story. I had begun in the familiar, rigorous third person of the scholarly work, but the accumulation of my own sense of what was hidden in the interstices of history, as it were, eventually appeared greater both in volume and perhaps significance to the bare historical record, from which Jean Welz, in both Vienna and Paris, as I've said, was almost entirely absent. I was in two minds. I was on the one hand concerned not to lose objectivity in the narrative, but on the other, what I'd been able to piece together is a story owed a lot to my own sense of what Welz was about, for better or for worse. Now that can be dangerous if it strays from objectivity into what is essentially subjective. But what I realised as I increased the input of my own sentiment to the telling was something that some scholars at least are very aware of, that the third-person objective mode can be to some degree false, a security blanket, disguising what are essentially subjective judgments, that are shaped into sometimes a masquerade of objective ones, but can fundamentally end up disguising the subjective as neutrality. In other words, there's an element of potentially specious objectivity hidden within the classic mode of writing. I was familiar with the phenomenon as I had played a very minor bit part in the first flush of structuralism in the 70s in England in the context of what came to be called film theory. But as one of the best known proponents of that debate asked, a theory of what exactly? It was really only in the long journey away from those neo-Kantian ideas of the autonomy of philosophy recorded in my book, The Matter of Vision, that I gained the distance from the conventional approach to be able to even think of embarking on the mode of writing that eventually developed in the Welz book. In essence, it simply combined as much in the way of corroboration as I could discover with my own account of what I think Welz was up to, while at the same time admitting, as it were, that there was a deal of speculation involved. That is to say, there was more than one possible explanation of more or less each point I was tempted to make, but I foregrounded those options rather than the classical approach of making your choice off-screen, as it were, and only presenting the decision rather than the options and the process, which I tried to root in my own form of corroboration, using the buildings, the designs, as witnesses that had to be deciphered, unpacked, stripped back to basics. The architecture was the core evidence. Now that sounds painfully obvious, but looking closely at the architecture is something that is perhaps surprisingly often absent from architectural monographs. But in this case, it was the golden resource and something that fascinated me. This was, above everything else, my raw material and the main tool upon which I had to rely. That is no bad thing, even if less common than we might expect, and at the best could perhaps be a strength of this particular approach to this particular fugitive subject. I would love to see a French version of the book, but I've been advised there would have to be an upgrade of the rhetoric to meet the demands of French language and culture. One of the things I like about the Anglo-Saxon approach, at its best, is the opposite. It is direct, straightforward. There is little or no performance, but only the facts and the points of the argument put down in a relatively unvarnished manner. The challenge of putting my quest into what was otherwise a rather threadbare story was faced in the actual process of writing. As the saying goes, writing is rewriting, and in that process I was on the one hand creating a web, if it might be called a thin web, from the odds and sods that turned up. What fixed it for me was the process of linking that horizontal plane downwards, as it were, to the historical record, to which I did have access, with Le Corbusier and Adolf Loos in particular. It comes to my mind as a visual image of a structural engineering solution. First, create your thin web, which in engineering would be a reinforced concrete raft. Then, from that horizontal, create reinforced, even pre-stressed pillars to go deep down through the subsoil. Here, the historical record of the past that goes deep into the rock beneath, hopefully anchoring the thin web. The iceberg metaphor also suggests that what we can see are the clues that have been revealed. What we see less is the much more substantial record below, around figures in this case like Corb and Loos, but that can be tied into the thin web at each point of the argument. The discussion, not for today, is a theory of knowledge, one that questions the extent to which traditional scholarship actually creates knowledge or skates over what may be increasingly thin ice. Tim Benton reacted to the book as exploring, quote, the network of interactions, innovations, and transmission of ideas that constitute the real history of architecture, unquote. That seems to me a very insightful comment, as that was indeed just my aim with the architecture of Jean Welz. Thank you.